Hi there. Welcome to another dialogue in the series that I'm doing at the Darling Foundry, Fonderie Darling, regarding this idea that I have called the new region of the world. This idea really being that we reached a point long ago of the certitudes of the West being that which we all have to adhere to. And that we've really come to, as Edouard Glissant says, we've come to the fond, we've come to the bottom of those certitudes. And we definitely have come to a new region of the world. That new region of the world has always been there. And what it really entails, it entails other narratives, counter narratives, narratives that come from other places, narratives that definitely are not marginal or from the margin. These are narratives that are central to contemporary life and contemporary art. Today, I'm going to be speaking to Mojane Behzadi. She is a curator, a cultural worker, a writer, a poet. She actually directs the infamous Art Speaks, which is a series, massive series of talks that take place in Montreal. And it's the only consistent international series of talks regarding contemporary art and life. People like Theaster Gates, Thelma Golden, John Curran, not John Curran, other big thinkers. She can describe who they are. And she also, that series is so central because it brings people together on a regular basis. Every few months, we'll have a big, very important person in the contemporary art world come and give a talk. These talks are sold out. I mean, they're free, but they're sold out. There's hardly any room. And what it really shows is that there's a critical mass. And I guess we're going to be talking a little bit about that today, about what is that mass and how do we form that mass. Today, one of the things I'm interested in talking is about her practice. She's also going to talk about my practice. And being both, at least I can speak on my behalf, being of Trinidadian parents and Mojane being of Persian parents, we are definitely children of exile in some way. And exile not so much as some sort of alienation or displacement, but it being a kind of interstitial space. And that space is important for the new region of the world. I wrote to Mojane a couple days ago about the idea of the guest. And I took this idea of the guest from her interview with Abbas Akavan. And I wrote, a guest arrives, and the guest is either welcomed or not welcomed. At the arrival is a threshold. The guest either walks over the threshold or is not allowed in or has to force themselves in over the threshold. The guest has to also understand where they are. They also have to understand the language of arrival, the language of the host, the language of transgression, to go beyond that. And the language of transgression is a language that the guest carries within him or her, or they. So today we're going to be talking about her interest in artists right now, artists that she's curated, artists that she writes about. And a lot of what I see is that this language, if you will, this language of transgression, that Mojane is interested in is very particular. She seems to be interested in atmospheres, in almost like a cosmopolitics, almost like this. She's taken an interest in artists that really are interested in things like synesthetics, in environments, in portals, and what I call the grammars of waiting. So I'm going to start and introduce Mojane and get to her right now. But one of the things I want to start with is this idea of thresholds and this idea of crossing thresholds. But before that, I think I want to dial back and I want to talk about the language that's used in the contemporary art world. And even the language that I'm using now. Because it can be very problematic, it can be exclusionary. And oftentimes, even people like myself who use that language, we're not always in the mode to talk about that language. So I want to begin with talking about how we talk about talking about contemporary art. So Mojane, welcome to the Fonderie Darling. Welcome into my my residency program, the Nouvelle Région du Monde. Mojana is a very dear friend. She's also somebody who really I can turn to in moments of great despair, which are very often the case in the contemporary art world, probably every day. And one of the interesting things is, I felt like I didn't want to impose, but I imposed a bit of a language on her, right? And that can be problematic because the language that I am asking her to speak is not necessarily the language that's necessary for her to speak in. Mm-hmm. So do you want to start there and talk about where you are, because she also works at Arctext, and maybe she'll talk a little bit about that. And let's speak a little bit about the language and how we speak about these issues and the problems around it.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much, James and the Fonderie Darling, for having me. It's an honor to be your guest on this series that you're doing here. And it's exciting to see how you've been working through this residency, this year-long residency at the Foundry, and very cool to be in conversation with you. And yes, you brought up these really amazing concepts when we were talking about what we would talk about today. And I was pushed to start thinking about my work through your lens.
Problematic.
No, actually, it wasn't problematic. I think it was really exciting because as a curator and writer, it's not often that we get the lens turned on us, and that, we talked about that too, that people analyze our work. We tend to be doing the analyzing of artists' work and asking the questions. And so suddenly when you brought up these concepts, and it really made me realize how much we have after this talk, let's say, to continue talking about that is going to be super enriching to the work. And it's so exciting to have someone examine and give the attention to your work that you don't necessarily have all the time. The feedback, the criticism, it's all essential to growing, really. But yeah, I think that on some level, I do resist, even when I was doing my master's in school and, we impose on you this idea that you're an academic. I've always been very resisting of that on some level. I love delving into theory, reading theory, engaging with ideas of all kinds, but I love to be able to stay, I think, really accessible in how I frame things. And so I wanted to meet you where you were wanting to engage, which was this really respectful and profound place. But I felt we needed more time to get there so that I could speak the way I speak and meet you where you were trying to ask me these really incredible questions. And what I told you too earlier, which we wanted to talk about now, is I'm at a place right now in this year where I've been doing a lot of administrative coordination work, working with ArtSpeaks, working with Arttext, and it's engaging a whole other side of my thinking too. And so the creative side and my curatorial sort of, thinking has taken a little bit of a back seat. And I really feel it. I went back through some of my writings and while we were preparing for this, and I'm like, wow, it's funny how your brain can shift even within the framework of a couple months, And right now, so I'm using this more pragmatic side of my brain, this logistics brain, which is very much part of the art world. We need that to make things happen. But I miss my poetic, more creative side. And I think preparing for this conversation with you, I realized that was something that that didn't feel super close at the moment.
And I think one of the things, because before we were talking about people that we've met and that have been engaging in a different way of how we talk about contemporary art, contemporary life. And I guess this was to be my second question, but it makes more sense to be my first question, is, and it's important for me to also outline and also to say that there's certain artists that I've seen you're interested in. Matthew Lacroix,
Yeah.
Miles Greenberg, Eve Tanguy, Abbas Akavan, Cindy Phoenix, Curtis Santiago, Marija Kitenge, Nicholas Schofield, especially Rita Esaib. And one of the first questions I had, which I guess we can put through a different lens, right? And I think maybe you can talk about the anecdote of that trip that you made, right? And it's this idea of this production of immateriality that seems to be about this production of materiality in contemporary art practice that seems to find a straight line through all of what you're interested in. And I start with your master's thesis and this idea of the production of light
Yeah.
and light shows and the reasoning for that. And this connects to this whole side of you that I didn't know, this interest in magic, in portals, love, spirituality, and these kind of themes that I had no idea that you were interested in.
Yeah.
So I guess when I wrote you, I was thinking of framing it in this theoretical way, but I think it's more important to go about it even in the way that you brought up earlier about that trip that you made.
Which trip is that? Sorry.
With the collector.
Oh yeah.
Because you went on the trip actually with people who are invested already, artists that are into this kind of production of immateriality.
Yeah.
And when I say production of immateriality, I'm talking about producing like stuff that's not material, stuff that's ephemeral, stuff that's like almost magic. And there's artists that are like that. Artists that make things that are incomplete. They're casts, or they're just light. They're things that are not real. So do you want to speak?
Or tangible, yeah.
Tangible. You know, I've named some of the artists.
Brian Geisen, too, in my thesis, where the artwork happens within your mind's eye, really, the imagery, that's where it happens.
So can we start maybe with some of these artists from your thesis?
Yeah.
And maybe we can get into the story later, but just to explain what this means, what does it mean to be interested in when artists are producing something immaterial?
I think like when I first decided to have a life in the arts, in a way, like it was almost a spiritual decision in a way. Like I think that what I was gravitating towards, the kind of practices that I was gravitating towards in the artists, and we're all doing work that in a way is made in lieu of a religion, but that is really like very much a spiritual practice. Sometimes you hear an artist, this is something that we come across quite often, where they say, if I wasn't doing art, I might as well be dead.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and that's something that I hear a lot among the artists that I work with. Like it's essential, just as breathing or eating. And I think in a way, we have in contemporary life, not everyone, a lot of people do observe religion or have religion in their life. I don't connect to Abrahamic religions or other religions. But I am highly spiritual, and I love pulling from religion in thinking about things and mysticism and these things. And so I was interested because when I was writing my thesis in 2016, this is when Trump was about to take power, and everything seemed really quite dark. And those are the moments that you want more light in your life, and you kind of go to reading about how you can transcend the reality that is very dark. And I think I was really interested in thinking about the 1950s, because it felt like a very similar time in terms of the Cold War and the kinds of inner lives that they might have been having and the beat poets and all that were something people that I was really engaging with in the literary side of things. And so I was interested in seeing what was happening, how artists were reacting or trying to cope through their work. And so I started working on Oscar Fischinger. He was the first. And he was doing visual music. So there were these animations that were kind of pulling from Kandinsky and non-objective films that were really like pulling from Eastern spirituality. And Oscar Fischinger emigrated to California during World War II, and he made this instrument called the lumograph, where he would stand behind this screen that he invented, and by pushing on the screen, it would activate these levers that would create these sort of light and colored shapes that he would then do compositions with his hands. And he would perform these in pitch black rooms, and it would create these almost spectral sort of colored figures in the space that were kind of felt suspended. And then from there, I also looked at Jordan Belson, who was a San Francisco-based artist, also working in animation and film, and also thinking through spirituality. And really, he and Henry Jacobs, from 1957 to 1959, made these concert called the Vortex Concerts at the Morrison Planetarium, which was one of the most state-of-the-art planetariums in the world. I mean, they were getting their projectors and their telescopes directly from NASA and the Army, and then they had these beautiful Carl Zeiss lens, and they were these hippies, and they got access to this very official space, this institution, really, somehow. Even they were surprised, and so they used all of the tools that were at their disposal, like the most incredible projectors. And Henry Jacobs was a musician, and he was doing musique concrète, and they did these series of audio-visual concerts in this space, and really creating or emulating, a spiritual or altered states. And really, I was trying to look at how we could talk about psychedelic experiences without talking about the drugs. And if we take the drugs out of the equation, then what is left? What is the actual quest? And that's a spiritual one. And so that was where my interest was. And Brian Geisen, who was living in Tanger and Paris with William Burroughs at one point, created this dream machine that was this perforated cylinder on a base that rotated at a certain speed, that when you would look at the thing, either with your eyes open or closed, you would, in your mind's eye, start seeing visions and imagery. And actually, I didn't experience an actual dream machine during my thesis research, but I did go to I call them the mind spa, where you could put this, they put these glasses on you that have LED strobing lights. And that do the same thing. And it's incredible. I was feeling, they essentially propel you into this deep meditative state that you couldn't attain unless you were a professional meditator, like a Buddhist monk.
Okay.
So it was really, and what that did is also led me back to my own sort of cultural background, because they were all pulling from Eastern spiritualities and authors and figures, and they were looking at whirling dervishes and Islamic mysticism, but also Buddhism and all that. So in a way, like I learned a lot about things that I think I didn't even know I was looking for in the process of writing that thesis.
That's amazing, because it feels like, and again, we're talking about, trying to like two curators talking about their interests. And what I get out of that is your interest in a total environment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Immersion, or I don't know if that's a good word, synesthesia.
Yes. You experience synesthesia.
I do experience synesthesia.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? How does it manifest?
It's a funny thing. I've never spoken about it in public, but I don't know if it's something cultural. It could be cultural because I'm coming from Trinidad. My family's from Trinidad, and the carnival is the main sort of like social body of the country, social, aesthetic, spiritual body of the country. So there's that environment. Carnival is a total environment, right? And I guess I'm just trying to sort of justify what this is, right? I'm also coming from a family of athletes that were very important in the 20th century. So my body is very, 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 very sensitive. But what I've experienced is that with music, I've always been able to see a narrative, a very clear narrative when I'm listening to music, a story, and a story that I would share sometimes with the musicians. And, this is really an example of the new region of the world where these senses, where things are not divided. I don't want to just say the West and not the West. That's a kind of silly thing to do. But definitely this idea of synesthesia, it's about being in a total environment. It's being enveloped in your sound, your smell, your vision. Everything envelops you, right?
Yeah.
And I just thought of somebody who you just interviewed, and maybe you could continue on that, because I wonder if he's a synesthete. I don't know. But I remember he says that he begins with smell, with olfactory. And I'm talking about Miles Greenberg. Maybe I could ask you a little bit about that, because it's interesting that Miles begins with sense. And, what has pulled you to be interested in his work?
Okay, so context, I did a podcast for the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts throughout last summer that came out in January, called Trajectories. And Miles Greenberg was one of the artists that I was interviewing. Well, I've known Miles since for 10 years or something. He was very young when I met him in the music scene. I have a whole community in the music world in Montreal, and that's where we met. And we, I think, connected because we were both interested in contemporary art or working in contemporary art. So that was kind of our connecting, moment, if you will. And well, I think it's so incredible to see his work evolve through time. He's been performing ever since I've known him, and he must have been 17 when I first met him, or something along those lines. And it's really, the way that I take interest in spirituality and being able to attain other states or altered states.
Because he does durational work.
He does durational work. So these long performances, sometimes 8 hours, sometimes 24 hours. He did one during the pandemic where he walked on a treadmill for 24 hours. And it's really interesting to me because it's like that liminal state that we are going to talk about, where, your body goes through a lot when you're standing on a rock for 8 hours, and you start to experience reality very differently. And then for the audience too, it's what he creates is these almost ritualistic environments that use smell, but also sight, and very they're very theatrical in a way. Like, I forget the name of one that I saw in New York in December.
Okay. Was it hemotherapy or
Yes.
something?
I think it has a similar name of what
Something
you're saying.
like that, yeah.
No, it was in anyway.
Before the
January or February 2020.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was, he had set up this, almost like this red carpet made of organic materials, meats and fruits and red sand, and there was incense, and he was painted himself entirely white and was holding a candle that was lit in his hand and had a receptacle on his head, and he was standing and
Wow.
really focused the whole time in this. Yeah, it's really, you know, brings you into a realm of just being an audience member, in that you're kind of you're venerating this figure in a way. And also feeling like the olfactory sense, like through the incense, then you start to kind of feel like you're in a space of a space of rituals and spiritual.
It's interesting because,
at least to me, I don't know if he would describe it this way.
Because in that interview with him, you actually speak about an architect that you actually speak about also with your close friend, Nick Schofield.
Yeah.
And it's Canadian Moshe Safdie. And, you know, Miles, when he's in the interview, he talks about the stairs at the Musée des Beaux-Arts and about this idea of immediacy, hypersensibility, about the atmospheres and, you know, contemplation. And I want to maybe just bring up a little bit, you know, Nicholas, because you're very close with him. So I think it's also something good to bring up. In the interview with him, he speaks about an album that he's made, which is an album which is dedicated or inspired by the building of the National Gallery of Canada. And what he does is he takes that gallery, the building, and he almost like, I would say, creolizes it. He takes it and he makes it into a ceremony. Probably not what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So do you want to maybe speak a little bit about Nick's work and your interest in his work?
Absolutely.
Because it seems in that interview, because as a musician, you're hanging around with a musician, but he's again interested in total environments. And really in what you're bringing up so far with me is the idea of ceremony.
So Nick Schofield is a musician. He works a lot in sort of ambient electronic music. And yes, he has an album called The Glass Gallery. And you know, we used to be roommates, and like a lot of the artists in my life who I end up collaborating with, we had many long conversations around our kitchen table at the time, when we were living together, around art. And that's how we began to really get, you know, like kind of riffing off one another on what we were each doing. And I would, you know, give him advice. It was really interesting how he would come to me as a curator, writer, for advice about his own sonic explorations. And likewise, I would go to him and ask him to read a text that I was writing and give me his feedback. And, you know, we're talking cross sense here too, right? And so I think that he is synesthetic.
Yeah, he seems synesthetic to me.
And I remember I would bring him with me to see shows sometimes, notably at the Sobey Awards at one point, exhibition at the National Gallery. And he's like, I really want to do something about this place or in this place. And then he, I think, spent an entire winter in Ottawa, where his parents are, where he partly grew up there. His mother worked at the National Gallery as well. So it's very much a part of his youth and upbringing. And so he grew up with certain paintings as though they were familiar characters in his life. And so he kind of made these pieces in response to, you know, the rhythms and the things that he would see happening in either the paintings or the architecture
Of the museum.
Of the
The music
museum.
was based on that.
Yes.
Okay.
And what it evoked in the very similar way as what you're describing, where he would compose and then these storylines would come to him. And
Wow,
he
I
talks
just got goosebumps.
Yeah, and when we talked, there was another interview for Rêve Sonore, which is another album that he did in the liner notes
Okay.
that we did together. And he talks about these stories that came up when he was doing the compositions around the mixing and all that, around these pieces that he really gets into this is a story of a grandfather who was, I'm just
When
giving-
he's making the music?
yeah, when he's putting it together, there's a story that starts to
Even though it's
emerge,
instrumental music.
even though it's entirely abstract instrumental music.
So there's a crossover
Yeah,
from, it's supposed to be non-narrative, but there's a narrative.
yeah.
Well, that's
So he
exciting.
responds almost sonically to and orally to the environment that he walks in, or at least in this case with the Moishe Safdie building. And it's true, like there was a central atrium, which is the name of the first song on that album, is a space of that Moshe Safdie saw as a space of procession and celebration and kind of these kind of pseudo spiritual realm that we're talking about. So I think it is quite relevant that you brought that up.
I think you got to fake it till you make it,
Yeah.
And it actually brings me to I want to ask a question, but I want to speak a little bit my
Yes.
interest in ceremony.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, I was born in Canada, but definitely Trinidadian in my brain. And the carnival has always been there as this secular, sacred
Secular, sacred, absolutely.
institution, which is what we've been talking about, which seems to be your interest. You're seeking out.
Yes, I know.
the
I'm
secular,
like looking for
sacred.
myself. It's almost like an existential thing.
I mean, it's a big surprise to me because I'm saying to myself, probably speaking a Trinidadian accent, saying, how come people don't know this girl? No, but it's kind of crazy because I didn't know exactly what your practice was in terms of like your interest, your discursive curatorial practice. But I can speak about my own interest in terms of ceremony because I've been fascinated by this my whole life. I've read books on the occult. I'm interested in secret societies.
Theosophy?
Not theosophy.
Okay.
I've always been reading these kind of books since I was 16.
Yeah.
My mother was a master's student, so she left me in the library, and I would just go reading all these books. But beyond the books, I sought this out in a real way, and I entered into exploring the Afro-Brazilian religions. I don't know if you know this about me.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Can you say a little more?
So I've done the first level of initiation into these religions. And I guess at a certain level, there's an aesthetic sense to it, which interests me. Because to me, what we're talking about is atmospheres, right? And that's a lot of what I think is what your interest is. When you're talking about the light production, the production of light and all that. When we talk about atmospheres, which I was telling you is a field of study right now in France.
And I really want to know more about it.
It's called les ambiances.
Yeah.
It's a field called les ambiances. Yeah. And, there's different, what they say is like a good idea of ambiance would actually, unfortunately, be the triumph of the will.
Okay.
The actual, the event that happened in the Reichstag, I guess it would be in Berlin. So that's a great example of atmospheres being created.
Yeah,
so first of
the
all,
movie, the film.
Huh?
Yeah, the film.
But in real life.
Yeah.
So some of the key things for atmosphere, the three things.
Oh God. There's a dark side to everything. Yeah.
But what's interesting is there's three things that are key to atmospheres. First is aura.
Yeah.
Second is mise en scène. The third is tuning.
Tuning.
And you actually write about that.
Really?
Yeah, you've talked about tuning in your writing. Yeah.
Using that word?
Yeah, you've used the word.
Really?
And
tell me more.
Because tuning is, you're in an atmospheric situation. So my own experience, again, getting back to that in ceremony, is that, my interest in it, of course, was aesthetic. Obviously, My interest also is the mise en scène. Of course, the prime interest was spiritual. But the real interesting part is the tuning. The fact that there's a tuning that goes on. There's an adjustment that is made to the point where this switch happens. This alternate reality. But there's tuning that goes on. You know?
Yeah, because you have to be able to, you know, in the same way that in music you'll do the same thing to like bring it to that perfect temperature or that ideal place where you're able to.
But the reason I bring this up is because, and I mean, I'm really interested in this because I've never asked you about this type of things, but not to put you on the spot, but is that I know for myself, as somebody born of West Indian parents and in a place that was not exactly welcoming in Quebec, I've had to seek out alternate realities. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the artists that you follow, not all of them are people of color, but they all seem to be seeking out or making other platforms, right?
Yeah.
And for myself, I know that's why I went towards Candomblé, and especially the aesthetics of it, the photography around it. But I'm interested, what interests you? Like, what brought you there? Like in your personal life, family life, your past life, aunts or uncles in Iran? Like, because it's specific what you're interested in. Doing a master thesis on the production of light is not a small task. So what is it is there something from your family, from your interest in Iran, from your personal life? What is it that's interested in you in this kind of, these artists that have these practices of going beyond a threshold of reality?
It's really funny you should ask about Iran, because the summer before I wrote my thesis, I went to Iran for the first time since I was 14. And I really traveled the country with my aunt, actually. So it's really funny.
Well, I said that because I read something.
Oh yeah. And, okay.
Yeah.
You read my acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And so I went to Iran. And we went to Shiraz, where there's a mosque, and I'm not going to remember the name of the mosque right now, but it's like really one of the you know, top 5 places to go visit there.
Okay.
This mosque where the architect was able to you know, like direct the positioning of the vitraux. A little Franglish, just for good measure.
Okay.
So the
window.
Stained glasses, that were, you know, in the primary colors in a way, and direct them towards the sun in a way where at certain times of the year, the light and color floods in all the way to the back of the room. And people of all observations and spiritual interest make this pilgrimage to go to this mosque and especially in that specific time of the year where it floods all the way through. When I went,
they go to see the light.
They go to see the light, and
the literal light flowing through this hole, or
through the stained glass, and so all the primary colors blend, and you essentially start to see. It's just like a meditative.
And you witnessed this.
Beautiful space. And my aunt brought me there. She didn't even tell me where we were going.
Wow.
One morning she's like, okay, we're hopping in a cab. We're going somewhere. And she brought me there. And it was incredible. And I didn't think about this consciously when I was writing my thesis the following year. But it certainly had, you know, now that you bring this up and you are asking the question, I think that it was part of the things that were already with me. And I think it's true of a lot of my, you know, I don't bring up my personal life and my work in a direct way. I think, you know, like I kind of translate everything into the kinds of subjects and themes that I'm trying to think about, but of course they all kind of emerge from the personal. And I think, you know, in terms of being, you know, of Persian background, I wasn't born there. I was born in France, and I grew up here in Montreal. And, you know, there's always a sense, and I grew up in a single parent household with my mom.
Okay.
And I think that there was a lot of a sense of, this is a lot of personal information.
Okay.
It's okay. I'm happy to share, but I think that there was a lot of feeling of uprootedness that, but I didn't know anything else, you know, that, you know, for me, this sense of not belonging or not feeling rooted, or particularly like I had solid foundations, that's just all I've ever known. And so I think, yes, I gravitate towards artists almost because, you know, they're probably thinking through the same things, and we're trying to resolve or work through things in subconscious ways, and we somehow, like, you know, like magnets find each other. But it's not overtly conscious. I think what is more conscious in recent years is really this desire to strive for social justice and self-actualization. So if artists are working with those things, that's how I framed it. But it probably comes from deeper places, you know.
You know, and it's funny when you're describing that light coming through. I mean, the closest experience I've had to that was, I think, the Parthenon in Rome.
Oh, cool. I've never been.
Rome is...
It floods all the way in?
Well, there's just this like little circle, and it's just the idea of the architecture being a total environment, you know, and it being a place of not just abode, but being a place of embodiment, you know, which seems to me... some of the stuff you're interested in, especially the artists. Yes. I mean, Nicholas and Miles. You know, these are like embodiment people, right?
Yeah,
and,
that's very true.
But what's interesting, when you talked about that light coming through, I actually thought of the actual title of your show that you created.
Spillover Love.
At
the Stuart Hall Art Gallery, not to be mistaken with Stuart Hall, our great writer, but it's a nice nod that it was that the gallery is called that. And
it seems like this, you know, plenitude, etc. And I'll just read my question in regards to that is, what interests me in reading the spillover love writing that you've done about the show is the notion of something being generative, something being meditative, and you know, this to me speaks to someone being able to cross a border.
Yeah.
Between what is familiar and something that's unknown. And I'm thinking of some of the artists, like somebody like Curtis Santiago. And what I wrote here is that Curtis is a Trinidadian artist, proud.
Yes.
Really nice guy also.
Yeah, very
living
nice,
in Berlin.
Lovely.
Made the good move. He presents this carnivalesque night. It's colorful, almost like a carnival, but a night, like
Sir Dingolay.
Yeah, Sir Dingolay. And it feels like a being or an entity having crossed into something else. Do you want to speak a little bit about the show? Maybe about Curtis, maybe about Marija. Marija has a nice piece. Marija Kitenge, Rehab Essay have good pieces. But all of these speak to this interest that you have in, again, atmospheres, but also this interpenetrating of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, even we were talking about portals earlier. Curtis is one of the artists who uses portals in his paintings and in his installation work too.
What do you mean by that?
Like he will use it as a recurring motif in his
really?
work.
Portals,
yeah.
okay.
And even just conceptually, this idea of Sir Dingolay who travels through time and in space to kind of in the speculative way in order to kind of sort of reach a kind of understanding of ancestors and those things. So definitely that liminal spatiality that we're talking about is something that's very present with him, and that's definitely something that's attracted me in thinking about his work.
Okay.
And Marija, what I loved about Marija, you know, he was one of the 2 artists who produced work for the show.
Okay, yeah. It's actually an amazing piece.
Yeah, I mean,
Is
there's
it-
several.
Well, there's flowers, but he
Yes.
did the drawing also.
Yeah.
Right? It's
So-
actually gorgeous.
they're so beautiful.
I hope he sticks with this kind of work.
Yeah, and actually, like, so he can draw them with his eyes closed perfectly because he drew tulips incessantly as a child. Or so, in a way, he calls the piece decolonial break. Or colonial break, or decolonial break, because in a way, like I gave him the you know, the pitch. This is a show about love and about self-actualization and social justice, and but it's very much about celebration and about joy and celebrating joy, and what he did is, like, you know, a lot of his work deals a lot more directly with you know, like tackling colonial issues, and they're a lot more serious in subject matter. And this was, in a way, drawing flowers, a way to break away from you know, the hard labor of working on the sort of struggles that he works with or thinks about through his work. And but of course, you know, I don't know if you read the little booklet, but so his father, traveling back from Belgium, I believe, brought back this brochure of gardens.
And Marija's from the Congo, right?
Yes, yes, exactly, brought back this brochure to the Congo after he had studied there. And on this brochure was this drawing of these flowers that were so unfamiliar to him and beautiful. And then he started drawing them incessantly. And that's why he says he can draw them with his eyes closed. But of course, it's linked to the colonial relationship still, you know, it's never quite far away in his work, but they're just beautiful. And they're set against these really beautiful pitch black backgrounds. And the ink on the prints was like incredible to see in person, just because it was like just the temperature of color, if we want, was so.
And there was the
thought
abstract
out.
one. That's
Yeah.
Is that in the show also?
Oh no, those are works that weren't in the show.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
they weren't ready when we did the brochure, so we had to put a stand in.
Okay. And I guess, like, we're getting to the point where, you know, there's this thing, and of course, I tried to figure out what you meant by this, and maybe because I'm a bit jaded about love, right?
Yeah.
But I wrote something to you. Can you look it
yes,
up?
yes.
Because one of the things that you're interested in your practice is the notion of love. And, you know, and what I wrote to you, kind of like maybe trying to fight you on this, is love is about getting over the previous loss of love. It's about crossing into a new region of time. Love in this sense is a form of transgression, and love is a spillover in the sense that we must love everything. Do you want to speak a little bit about this interest you have? Because, I mean, this, to me, real love is transgressive. It's not something which is wishy-washy.
Oh yeah.
So, like, when you tell me that your love is of interest to you in your curatorial practice and your philosophical practice, when I first think about it, I find it like, you know, I'm not understanding it.
Yeah.
But now I start to understand. You want to speak a little bit about that? You can speak about Cornel West.
Oh,
Bell
and
Hooks.
yes, exactly. So it started with watching this new school talk online that Bell Hooks, who I love, and Cornel West had. That was just so incredible. And it was about love and the way that they were talking about it in very spiritual terms, and about, you know, love in the public sphere is justice, and how, you know, like those are two sides of the same coin in a way. But in terms of, you know, and the way that I look at love is it's you know, a way of transcending the struggles, and it's a way of resisting the because I think the thing about discrimination is it tries to tear you down, and by not accepting that and pushing even harder not to aim for joy and love and being self-actualized, and you're in a way that's the biggest form of resistance, and it's quite radical. I think, especially in terms of like the things that Cornel West and Bell Hooks were talking about. But then I also was thinking about, other ways to talk about that, because all the artists bring up in that show, bring up love in very different ways, with just the being able to do art and to be an artist. That in itself is like one of the biggest dedications to love, because you're doing something that is, in terms of the capitalist system we live in, pretty counterintuitive and counterproductive to that. And it's a form of resistance, but it's also a form of love. And, like to want to spend your days putting, brushstroke on a canvas, or thinking through ideas and aesthetics. I mean, it's pretty radical, and it's pretty, you have to have such a profound conviction and dedication and love of what you're doing to be able to do that and to strive for that. So that was also part of what I was thinking, and what of some of the artists that I chose really, made me think of. And in the case of Cindy Phoenix, her monstrous figures are, really reminded me of I Love Dick by, what's her name?
The
Chris
book
Cross.
by Chris Cross, yeah.
And this idea, like in that book, the character, the main character, Chris, actually, ends up really putting herself through the most like abjection to sort of impress Dick, who's the person that she writes love letters to through the entire book. But she's putting, like, this person has no interest in her, but in the process of writing him these letters and kind of throwing herself at him in the way that she does, by the end of the book, she's self-actualized in a way, because she's, when you're in love, you're kind of striving to be the best version of yourself. But if you end up doing it, even if the person doesn't care about you, and you kind of use that as a kind of conduit, if you will, or in the case of this book, you end up kind of discovering the best version of yourself, and you're in the end doing it for you, and you've come to this place of arrival at the end with her. And in her monstrous figures and the way they throw themselves.
Cindy Phoenix, the artist in your show.
Yeah, and in some of the conversations that we had, it was quite kind of this love or self-abjection, or this idea, of the monstrous as something that, is not that really, and that leads us to a self-discovery and acceptance, really, that I found really interesting. Yeah.
Feels like love is a conceptual art project.
Yeah.
Like love is a conceptual project.
Yeah.
In some sense.
In a way, it's one of those incredible experiences to feel so alive, whether it's like...
It's synesthetic also.
Yeah.
It's completely synesthetic.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because you're actually in love with somebody, and you're actually having feelings in your body,
Yeah, and you experience vision and food differently, and all these things. And that's, we're talking about romantic love mostly, but there's so many different kinds of love. And that was also something I was thinking about in the altruism and the, selfless, like, giving. And yeah. James, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about two of the projects, well, actually three projects that you've been working on. I don't know if you could talk about them in the time that we have. But first you just released a short film. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I actually went to film school and I dropped out.
Oh.
And
when and where was that?
the University of Southern California,
Okay.
USC Film School.
Wow.
The writing program. And it's interesting because my entrance to that program was based on poetry that I wrote. And I got a scholarship based on that. But my ability to actually work inside of that program was related to my writing poetry, which we can talk about if we go over a few more minutes. But what's interesting is that whole thing of this kind of synesthetic experience that I have of closing my eyes and being able to see a story. It's something that really it's something that really feeds me, but it's something which protects me. It's something which makes my sense of exile feel a lot more splendid than damage. And so I've always tried to remain within the cinema aspect of things. In fact, I'm getting to what we're talking about. In fact, and this is a longer conversation, I've always thought to myself that there's three temporalities. That there's day, there's night, and there's cinema. I actually think there's that third. So when we're talking about everything we're talking about in terms of atmospheres, total environment, for me, I think the opera is the most total environment, but cinema for now is a total environment. Unfortunately now from home, but the actual cinema. So for me, it's a space for me to get other ideas out. Ideas that are not necessarily connected to my interest in contemporary art, but my interest in advocacy, in anti-racism, but even more in actually looking at how we talk about history. So I just made a short film, originally with the CBC. Don't know who really owns it or where it is now, but it was released a couple months ago. And it's about how we construct narratives of nation and how the narrative of Canada has been constructed. And again, it's this use of these atmospheres, of a total environment to construct a reality. So the film is about the notion of terra nullius, which is this notion of how they took the land here in Canada, which means terra nullius means that it's nobody's land, and that's a justification for the settlers coming and taking the land. So what I did is I did a film where we were talking about we were actually talking about a baseball player named Jackie Robinson and why he was welcomed into Canada and how his welcoming into Canada was a false narrative. And what I did is I spoke about the narrative before that and the narrative how Canada has been constructed as this benevolent society with open arms. So what I did is I decided to look at how nation is built through images and through total environment. And the way it's been built in Canada has actually been through literal visuality. The first being the Canadian Pacific Railway. And it's a short film, but you see all these images. You see how Canada has been constructed as this lily white virgin territory, which without any social blemishes. So when that's constructed, again, it is synesthetic in some ways also, right? Because you have this vision of Canada as the Great White North, right? But with that vision of the Great White North means that there was nobody here when the settlers came. So in that short film, I show the visual register of how Canada has been built like this, starting with the Canadian Pacific Railway ads from the 1880s, all the way to the Group of Seven painters, because the Group of Seven are the best example of a total environment being created where there's this vision of Canada or vision of a nation. And the Group of Seven are famous for these incredible paintings that they did of just these big, vast Snow Age backdrops with nobody here. So that's the first thing. And then you were going to ask about something else.
Oh, and you're doing a show on CBC, which I'm so excited to see.
Again, in the same register as looking for other ways to speak about the contemporary and include everybody in the contemporary. I was very lucky to be recruited by Henri Pardot and Judith Bress, producers and filmmakers. and Daniel Mujica and Eric Kanago, producers. And what we've done is we've created a series called Afro Canada. It's a 4-part series, I guess an hour something each. And it's the telling, again, of the story of the new region of the world, which has not been told here. The story of Blacks in Canada. But I have to tell you, the approach to it is almost ceremonial.
Okay, how so?
There's something that happened in that series where we transcended filling in another history or adding to history. Because that's problematic. It's problematic when you say, you know what? Well, we weren't included in that history. So what does that mean? You just add the name to the page? It's still the same book.
Yeah. Through like speculative.
Yeah, it is speculative. So there's a mix of science fiction. There's a mix of docudrama. But there's this real serious, I won't say spiritual, but almost like divine thing that came through by including poets, including figures and historians. And there's this sort of divination, I think. I think the project is magic.
That's incredible.
To be very honest with you.
You're speaking in terms that really resonate here.
No, but it's a big budget television series which has gone through all, we had carte blanche to do what we did.
Yeah.
And the whole team is BIPOC. And that talk about cooperation.
Yeah.
I think it's a miracle, the series, that there was a way that like the film, people were brought in mentoring people. So people who were lower down in the directing category were being mentored. So there's a whole system that's been created. And the system was through respect, through cooperation, but also through, il y avait une croyance. There seemed to be a belief in something. And you'll see it. It's very meta. It's a very meta series. I am writing another TV series myself. On this one, I'm a screenwriting assistant, assistant to screenwriting. I'm one of the head researchers, so that's another project. Yeah,
that's incredible.
Yeah.
Do we have a minute to talk about the gallery you're opening?
Well, it's not a gallery as much as like a pop-up.
Okay.
But I've decided after being part of the system that we were speaking about before, the John Henry system. And let's end with that, right?
Yeah.
And you can explain it in a minute, but after being in this system where institutions still refuse to include us in a real way, but instead are doing what's called virtue signaling, doing inclusion tokenism, I finally came to the reality in this residency that we really, and people always say this, build your own institution, build your own institution.
Build your own space, yeah.
So I've decided to do something in a minimal way.
Yeah.
But the first show will be the first week of September.
And what will it be called?
The name of the show is called United in Flames.
United in Flames, and what's the name of the pop-up?
It's called Fauna.
Fauna.
Yeah, Fauna. And it's an all-white space, and in the sense that it's going to be a total environment. It's also a flower shop, a floral studio. So it's a total environment between nature and between the construction of images.
Yeah.
So that's something that will be happening in the first week of September.
That's incredible. I look forward to all the projects.
Well, you've just interviewed me, and I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's things that we wanted to cover that we didn't, but I feel like we'll have other opportunities to get into it.
And thanks for sharing a bit of your world. Because
thank you for reading my work and actually engaging. That's incredible. I've never had this level of like someone knowing what I did. Yeah.
No, it's awesome. So essential for us at certain moments in our lives to actually have somebody else or even I think somebody else actually come in and say, hey, what is the cosmology of your life?
Yeah.
What is it that guides you? Who are your divinities? Who are your influences? What is the map? And and I think when you talk about the new region of the world, we're remapping.
Yeah.
And that's really so. That is what we have for today. And I want to thank Mojane for a very easygoing conversation, which is enlightening and actually making me think a lot about how we talk about contemporary art and how we really think about things that we take for granted, like the notion of love as transgression and other ways that we think about the states of being and go beyond states of being that are important when we're talking about going towards a real new region of the world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mojane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fondry.